First rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club.
I was going to rip his heart out. I'm the best ever. I'm the most brutal and vicious and most ruthless champion there's ever been.
Conor McGregor is going to blank Khabib when you guys meet each other.
Stomp on his head as he's unconscious.
Get up, you son of a bitch! Mickey loves you.
I promise I'll work so hard.
God, this is a mistake already.
Fast! Last night I cut the light off in my bedroom, hit the switch, was in the bed before the room was dark.
Ward trades his way back. Ward nods as if to say, come on.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done.
I'll stop him. Stop me.
Even before the fight of the century took place, people were choosing sides. The match pitting Joe Frazier against Muhammad Ali, who, with the exception of one warm-up fight, was coming off a 3-year ban from the sport after boycotting the draft for the Vietnam War. The climate around race and politics mirrored the issues of today.
This was going to be a huge event, not just because it was a championship fight, but because it included all of these kind of sidelight things that were going on literally in the entire country.
At the time, Tim Ryan was a young news and sports broadcaster for WPIX. With just a few fights under his play-by-play belt, Ryan was asked to do the radio broadcast for New Zealand radio because they couldn't afford to send their own reporter.
I was stunned that that was being offered to me, a chance to actually call the fight. And it turned out that I was the only English language radio broadcaster of the fight.
A few days later, when newspapers found out the fight was not being broadcast to military bases around the country, promoters asked Ryan if they could carry the broadcast.
So the general called the next morning and hired me. He said, "We haven't got any money." I said, "That's okay. I'm honored to do this for the Armed Forces Radio Network."
Ryan details the fight in his book, On Someone Else's Nickel, A Life in Television, Sports, and Travel. March 8th, 1971. The night of the fight, Ryan says the Garden was filled to the rafters. More than 20,000 people packed the arena, wearing everything from blue jeans to black tie.
It was a very glamorous crowd, showbiz people, Sinatra, Diana Ross, and all kinds of famous people, like celebrities come to the big fights now. But I don't think any of them have been matched by the group that came that night to the Garden.
But once inside, Ryan says there was a palpable tension in the air.
The ones who were anti-Ali were going to be for Joe Frazier, whether or not they were boxing fans.
Frazier won the 15-round slugfest by decision, knocking Ali to the canvas in the final round. Ali would go on to win both rematches. And because of the trilogy, Ali got to bring his message of equal rights around the world. And Ryan said that has been the biggest lasting impact from this fight. When asked who his favorite athletes are of all time, he always mentions Ali and Billie Jean King for their work outside of their sports.
As detailed perfectly by WPIX television in New York City, they remember 50 years ago, March 8th, 1971, a date which will truly live in sports legend. Because no doubt it not only changed the sport of boxing, it changed sports in general, and it did indeed change the United States. Hi once again, everybody. I'm Ed Berliner, and welcome into this special edition of The Man in the Arena, because this is Randy's Ringside. When it comes to boxing and fighting, there is only one man that I turn to. I have known him for many years, and he knows the sport inside and out. Matter of fact, I sometimes wind up calling him and going, "Randy, do you know this and do you know this?" He says, "Oh yeah, no, I remember that perfectly." He probably still has all the press passes to places that he has been and events that he has been at. And specifically, this is a fight that lives in his memory and so many others. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. And here we go. Let's welcome in the gentleman who makes Randy's Ringside sing when it comes down to the sport of boxing. He also is heard on Sirius XM with Jerry Cooney, his co-host on At the Fights. It is Monday and Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Channel 156. He's going to tell me real quick if I got all that correctly, just from memory. Let's welcome in Randy Gordon once again to the Man in the Arena and Randy's Ringside. How'd I do? Did I get it, Coach?
Man, that was absolutely perfect. Are you sure you don't have a teleprompter there or something? I can't even remember that.
Teleprompter? What, are you serious? You think we can afford the big time here? This is 21st century television, baby. We do it all on about a nickel and get it all done, man. But when I watch you on Facebook too. You also have Randy's Ringside on your Facebook page, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, and that's open to everybody else to look at it and be part of as well. It's funny too, because you know me, I'm a historian in sports, and I go back and I remember all these dates.
Yeah.
I woke up this morning, and we're doing this show live on March 8th, 2021. I woke up and said, wait a minute, March 8th, you dummy. How could you have missed this one? And that's when I immediately called you. I said, we have to sit down and talk about it. Because, Randy, I honestly, out of all the sporting events that I've been to, and I wasn't at this one. Let's make this very clear. I was a kid when there's no way I could have gotten into Madison Square Garden at that point. I couldn't afford it. I watched it I heard it on radio at that point, like so many other people, and then learned about it many years later. This fight, this sporting event changed America more than any other event I can ever think of in sports. Okay, is that hyperbole? Am I going too far?
Not at all. Not at all. And I mean, through all the World Series that took place before that, and the big fights that took place before that, and the Super Bowls after that, and everything else, when you take the very first Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali fight, and I always put the winner first. Frazier did win it. So that was the Frazier-Ali fight. When you take that and compare it to any other sporting event in history, and I don't care whether it was some NASCAR championship or World Cup soccer championship, and every one of them could be huge. There was nothing that ever came close to Frazier-Ali, March 8th, 1971. Nothing.
Well, let's set the stage then, because not everybody knows the story, of course. We're dealing with an audience here globally that's watching us, and some know and some don't, and different ages. Because many people will say, it's 1971. Come on, you guys. These are just a couple of boxers who stepped into the ring, and as a matter of fact, one was a draft dodger who finally was getting a chance to come back and fight. Another guy was from the hardscrabble streets of Philadelphia, and many people really didn't like him. I mean, that's sort of the public perception that walks in immediately sometimes when you talk about Ali and Frazier. So then let's break it down. When we say that this changed so many things, let's first look at boxing and the sport itself before we get to the social issues in America. How did this then change the sport?
It just changed the sport by being as big as it did, and it brought, of course, every fight fan came out for it, but not just the fight fans. Everybody was interested in this fight. Now, I actually gave something to Jerry Cooney the other day that he used on a talk show he was on with Bob Arum. And the fact is, the war in Vietnam was going on at that time. The war in Vietnam actually stopped that day. That's how big this fight was, because the Viet Cong, they also wanted to see the fight. So Jerry Cooney repeated that, and Bob Arum basically said, you know what, that's a nice story, and it works well in the movies and things like that. But that didn't really happen because there was no pay-per-view over in North Korea. So that couldn't have happened. Over in Vietnam, there's no pay-per-view. Here's what happened. The fact is, today, you know that people around the globe steal things. They hack into your computers. And this is so many decades later. Well, it was easy to do it then. And what the Viet Cong did, they wanted to see the fight as much as we did. So they basically hacked into it wasn't even pay-per-view, it was closed circuit. They were able to hack in.
That's right.
And they watched it. So that day, they were not shooting at the Americans. And the Americans, they really wanted to see it. So they pulled back, and both sides stepped back, and there was no fighting that day. It resumed the next day. How do I know this? because one of the great referees of all time, the late, great Irish Wayne Kelly, happened to be over in Vietnam at that time. And a few years before his death, about 9 years ago, Wayne decided to get closure on the whole Vietnam. He got out in about 68. He wanted to go back to Saigon and all over there. And while he was sitting in a bar in Saigon, sitting next to him was a guy who looked Korean or so forth. And they got to talking, and the guy spoke English. And he said, "Are you from America?" Wayne Kelly said, "Yes." And they got to talking. And the guy asked Wayne, what brings you back here? And Wayne says, "I needed some closure because I fought for the United States against the Viet Cong." And the guy said, "Oh, I was in the Army too. What battles did you fight in?" And Wayne told him, and the guy said, "I fought in one of those battles as well." And Wayne said, "Wow, we were on the same team fighting the Viet Cong." He said, "No, I was part of the Viet Cong."
Wow.
And Wayne said, and he wound up leaving North Vietnam, and he moved into South Korea years later. And they got to talking, and they're sitting there sharing drinks together. And they looked at each other, and they're hugging each other, sharing their stories, crying their eyes out. And the guy said, "Why couldn't all of us be like this?" And then he asked Wayne, "What do you do?" And Wayne said, "I'm a boxing referee." And the guy said, "Boxing referee? Wow." And they started talking. And the guy said, "I'm a big fight fan." And he said, "I got out of the service in late 71. He said, we watched the Frazier Ali fight because we stole the feed." Wayne said, "Wait a minute, you watched?" And he said, "Yeah, we were able to," and we were all in this big area, and they had basically like movie screens that they just dropped the movie screen and then showed it on the stolen feed, and all the Viet Cong were watching. That's how I know the Viet Cong also watch, and they stopped their bombing, their sneak attacks and everything else, and so did we. The war that day in Vietnam came to an end because of the hugeness of this fight.
When we think about the fight itself, Ali versus Frazier, and knowing full well that, as we know now through history, there were two other magnificent fights, and before we even get to the fighters themselves, but the immense nature of this fight, is it fair to say that without Ali Frazier, and then without Ali Frazier 2 and 3, that the sport of heavyweight boxing and even the sport of boxing itself may have been dropped into a black hole and certainly may have never reached the heights that it reached in the 80s and the 90s without these two personalities?
Quite possibly, yes. But that first fight was so great. Now, a few years later, they went at it a second time. The first fight was terrific. The second fight really wasn't. Ali jabbed and danced and grabbed his way to a 12-round decision. And that fight was actually so bad that, you can't even picture that there would be a third fight that would become the most savage heavyweight fight of all time. But had Frazier maybe won that second fight, there probably would have been no third fight. But the first fight was just so incredible, it just captured everybody. The fight fans, the non-fight fans, everybody wanted to see it. They wanted to go to the theaters. They wanted to be there. They wanted to just hear about it, read about it, talk about it. I remember, and I was only 21 years old at that time, people who knew nothing about boxing were asking me then, and I was I was in college. I was in my last year of college. They were asking this budding young fight fan about the fight. I wasn't there. I was in a movie theater with a whole bunch of my friends on Long Island. And the place was packed. The place held about 1,500. And I think there had to be about 2,500 standing in the aisles. And I would say about 75% of them were Muhammad Ali fans. I was a Joe Frazier fan. And me and my friends all kind of were rooting for Frazier, but we were more or less doing it very silently because all the others were Ali fans. And I was bobbing and weaving. I was drenched with sweat by the time the fight was over because I was watching it, bobbing and weaving and throwing shots with Frazier. I had no voice left because every time Frazier would land a hard shot or Ali would rip off a combination, it was over and over again from the entire crowd. I have never had such a good time watching a professional boxing match.
You mentioned something earlier where you talked about the crowd that was around it. And if people watch sometimes some of the different documentaries and some of the different features that came out of that time, Frank Sinatra was there taking pictures.
Yeah.
You saw everybody from the entertainment world, people from the acting world. That's why when you look at this fight, it would seem that this was the first fight. Now, certainly, there had been fights before in the 20s and the 30s and throughout history. But it would seem as if this fight captivated a wider audience than anybody could have ever imagined, because it was the place to be at that. If you weren't at Ali Frazier, there's an old joke that says if you weren't there when Babe Ruth hit his 714th home run, if there were 5,000 people there, 10 years later, 50,000 people said they were in the stands to see that home run. Same thing for Bond's home runs or great moments in Stanley Cup history, whatever, but it's the same thing. If you weren't in that crowd, what Madison Square Garden was maybe what at the time? 15,000 people maybe for the fight?
No,
again, I'm guessing. If you weren't there, you were saying years later, there's now 5 million people that say they were there at the fight that night.
Oh, of course. The actual crowd was 20,455. That's how many were in the
happened to know
building.
that. That's all. Just a number you just threw out of nowhere. Yeah.
It absolutely is, because I've been talking about this fight for so long. I mean, since 1971, I talk about this fight. This fight actually took place a few days before my birthday. And to me, this was a terrific birthday gift. I was going to be 22 years old. And for me, if you asked me, what do you want for your birthday? I would have said, Frazier Ali fight. Give me the Frazier Ali fight. And little did I know that down the road I'd have the career that I did. I was already a bit friendly. I had met Frazier at an amateur fight, and we became friendly. But I never knew that I was going to get to become like best friends with Muhammad Ali. And when I became commissioner, Ali, who was already 7 years retired, every time he'd come into New York, he would call me up the night before, said, I'm coming in, Commissioner. Can we have breakfast? Can we have lunch? And it was just me and Muhammad. And I asked him so many questions about this fight. I asked Frazier about this fight. And the stories that I have, I could write my own book on this fight just from talking to both of them. There were death threats on both of them. They had incredible security around them. The stuff that went on just to get them into the ring is unbelievable. And I wish, I look at the commissioner there, Edwin Dooley, because I became Edwin Dooley years later, except I was the commissioner who knew what he was doing, if you will, because Edwin Dooley was basically a political hack, and he was there for the pictures and whatnot. I was the fight guy who got the job, and every time I see it, and I used to tell Ali and Frazier that, man, I wish I could have been in the middle there. And I'm going to, I think, somehow graphically one day cut Dooley out and put myself in the middle, because I've had that position. So I definitely want to do that and just put it on my wall.
So all the entertainers and all the people there, and you just touched on this, so let's get there. Death threats. People, I think, in this day and age in 2021 don't realize, in many ways, what America was in 1971. We were coming out of the era of the 60s where there was more civil unrest than ever before in the country, where the war was unpopular, where soldiers were coming home and being spat upon, where there was a president who was in office at that point who was basically breaking as many laws as he possibly could, where there were murders on universities. Let's not forget so much. It was an incredibly difficult time for America that still resonates to this day. The social impact of that fight in 1971, that in and of itself, I think, is greater, Randy, in many ways than the fight itself when you look at what it did and how it brought people together. And I think it opened up a lot of wounds, too, because certainly Black America was screaming at that time saying, this is who we are. These are our heroes, and it's about time you saw them, because I think many believed at that point that Jackie Robinson had been forgotten in so many ways, that it had been left behind by white America. So Black America had a chance to actually come forward and say, this is us. So when you were there in college and what you experienced, what did you see and what did you feel as part of that social impact outside of the fight and the athleticism itself?
Well, because I was living through that as a college student, I was amongst, I wasn't a draft dodger by any means, but I really wasn't for the war. I never marched in the, make love, not war. I wasn't with the love beads and whatnot. I didn't want to see the war go on anymore.
Because people were waking up in 1971. They were understanding what it was finally.
And you mentioned the president. Richard Nixon was our president. I mean, we were going through some incredible changes in America. Only 2 years earlier, we landed men on the moon for the very first time, and there were actually more people who watched the Frazier-Ali fight than actually were tuned into the lunar landing, because the lunar landing was so, even though it was very important, it was more or less, it was an American thing. This was a worldwide event.
Despite the fact that it was two Americans.
But it was more than two Americans. They just transcended. It was sports. It was boxing. It was a major heavyweight championship fight that, as we mentioned earlier, the Viet Cong had to see it. That's how encompassing this thing was. I do remember so much about, I don't even have to check this out. It was just ingrained into me. I remember the gasoline at that time, if you can believe this, was about 33 cents a gallon. Yeah, that year, the voting age was 21, and one of the things that I did campaign against was I wanted the voting age dropped from 21 to 18. And we protested all the time. We marched all the time in college, because we were being sent to Vietnam to shoot people we had nothing against whatsoever, and they're shooting back at us. We were being drafted at 18 years old, yet we couldn't vote to say who the politicians were who were going to be sending us over. And that year, the voting age was dropped. And I do remember that the songs that were being played right then, I mean, Michael Jackson, he was like a little kid. He had a few of the hits at that time were Mama's Pearl by the Jackson 5. The Osmonds had One Bad Apple. The Carpenters had a love song called For All We Know. The Temptations with Just My Imagination. Every time I hear those songs, I go right back to the night at Madison Square Garden, March 8th, 1971, days before my 22nd birthday.
For someone who was there then, and we've talked about the social impact, these were two black men who had captivated the world and the United States. It was incredibly difficult to be an American of color in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and certainly even today. It has permeated into the 21st century. But if you look at that time, Black America was looking for a reason for someone to say, we exist. We are not a quiet race of people. We are Americans. They needed something to stand up for. So as you went through this and watched, certainly the color barrier was a massive part of this. Yet, for one night, it seemed as if America didn't see color. That was a shocking, at least it appears that way. But I think under the surface, there was a lot more that we didn't see.
You know, these were two African Americans that were so different from one another, because one was a member of the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali, who had been named Cassius Marcellus Clay 7 years earlier. And the night that he beat Sonny Liston for the championship in Miami Beach on February 25th, 1964, he had already been making inroads to become a Muslim. And he came out after the Sonny Liston fight and said, my name is no longer Cassius Marcellus Clay. That's my slave name. I am now going to be known as Cassius X. And then it went from Cassius X, it went to Muhammad X. And then it went to Muhammad Ali Aj. And he became basically the same fighter with a different name. How many athletes have two names that are just so well known throughout history? Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. And he began to speak for the entire Black community. Well, most of them, because some of them didn't believe in. Well,
let's be fair. There was a good facet, a good portion of Black America, and the words were used. Uncle Tom. I mean, many people felt that Ali had sold out to white America, and he had left behind Black America in order to become public, in order to become famous, and in order to make money. Was that true?
But more so, Muhammad Ali almost painted Joe Frazier to be the Uncle Tom. And I spoke at length to both of these guys. And for years, when Ali had been stripped of his title in 1967 for failure to step forward for military induction, it was Joe Frazier that really helped keep him afloat, gave him money, and said, you ever make it back, you can pay me back, whatever. And the two of them were friends. But then in the way that Ali would do it, over the next 3.5 years, as Joe Frazier defended the title that he won in Ali's absence, Ali started beating the drums for a possible comeback because he knew it was in the Supreme Court. They had his case. And he got stripped of the title in 1967, and it was in mid-1970 he got his license back again. And at this point, he had really been beating the drums for a fight between the undefeated him and the undefeated Joe Frazier. And in the way that only Ali can do it, he belittled Joe Frazier. He even told me, he said, I know that I went too far with Joe. I helped get them back together in their final years because Ali never disliked Joe. It was Joe who disliked Ali. Joe once said to me, He calls me an Uncle Tom. I'm blacker than he is. I said, I get it.
That brings up a point, though, because you're talking about that. Let's touch on that. I mean, there are people who say that they honestly hated each other. You're saying that's not true?
At one point, yes, the night of the fight, they totally disliked each other.
But I mean, okay, dislike is one thing. Are we talking about a seething hate between these men? Because Ali did drive this to be about, and we'll get to that here in a little bit, how stupid Joe was. And I mean, and certainly by the time they got to Manila, when he held up the rubber gorilla and was punching that in the face, you know, that certainly said something else to Joe as well. So it would seem to me that Ali didn't hate Joe. He used Joe in a brilliant marketing sense, whether it was Muhammad or somebody else who got involved. But Joe really seethingly hated Muhammad Ali. That's what came through.
He absolutely did. And Joe told me this in one-on-one meetings with him. I had lunches with him. I had breakfast with him. And as late as a lot of this was when I became commissioner in 1988. And I started spending more time with both of the guys. And I did my best. And it took years to bring them together because Joe was very stubborn. He said, look what he did to me. Look at the names he called me. And I said, but you see what you guys did together. He was building up your fights. And he said, yeah, look how he did it. Look how he did it. On ABC television, it was only maybe a month or so, or 6 weeks, 8 weeks after their first fight, they got together with Howard Cosell in studio, and they sat next to each other.
Actually,
and
what you're talking about happened in January of the next year, which we'll see in a couple of moments. I want to actually show people what that was who've never seen it. But go ahead and talk about that again.
I realized that it wasn't right after the fight because both guys were healing up. They were banged up. Joe Frazier spent about 10 days in the hospital after the fight from basically dehydration and just exhaustion from the fight. Ali was more or less peeing blood for the next 2 months. So, yeah, it was...
So who really lost the fight? With what you're talking about is all true. I mean, Frazier won on points on 3 cards, but did Frazier really lose this fight in the end result?
In the physical beating that he took, I think Frazier did lose it. But in rounds, remember there are 15 rounds, and every round is scored. And all 3 officials, the referee Arthur McCanty and the judges Artie Idala and Bill Recht and Judge Randy Gordon, I mean, I had it 9-6, and that's exactly the way Judge Artie Idala had it. Bill Recht had it, I believe, 11-4, and Arthur McCanty had it 8-6-1. I have met very few people over the years, although I do know some who had Ali winning. And I must have watched this fight 100 times, if not more. And every single time, Joe Frazier wins the fight. You can't, I've watched it, obviously rooting that night for my man, Joe Frazier. When I was commissioner, I would sit in my office sometimes on slower days, and I would just watch the fight. I watched the fight several rounds with Muhammad Ali, and he said, man, he hurt me that round. He hurt me. I couldn't show people how bad I was hurt. He said, and then I'd hit him with a few jabs and I'd shake my head, but man, he hurt me. They hurt each other. As a matter of fact, people don't even realize this, that they each fought from 1971, from the night of that fight. Ali fought 29 times in 10 years. Joe Frazier fought only, I believe it was 10 times. He was 5-4-1. 5 wins, 4 losses, 1 draw, and they both retired within about a week of each other in December 1981. Joe Frazier wanted a 4th fight with Muhammad Ali, and he said he wasn't going to stop until Ali stopped. And they both, within a week of each other, fought in December. Ali lost to Trevor Berbick. Joe Frazier fought to a draw against Jumbo Cummings, somebody he would have knocked out in his prime. And when they both had those fights, they realized it's over. But I have a feeling that even if it wasn't over for both of them and they could have been given a fourth fight, they would have fought just as hard in fight number 4 as they fought in 1, 2, and 3, which I said may be the most savage fight that I've ever seen.
I want to set some of this up for folks who are not aware. And you mentioned the Cosell on ABC's Wild World of Sports. I want to get to as well and talk about that. There is a brilliant documentary that is rarely seen, and if you do search it out on YouTube, you can find it. It is called The Fighters. And there is a portion of The Fighters, well, the large portion of The Fighters does not deal with the fight. It deals with the preliminary to the fights and the way everything led up to it that day and in the days around it, and the training and the people and the celebrities who were there. And that's why I heartily recommend people look for it, because here's just a short clip from it, from The Fighters. And this is in the locker rooms. And if you take it in light of what we know about the boxers today and what they said and how they said it, and some of the bravado that was going on versus the non-bravado from the other fighter, it's a fascinating character study. This again is from The Fighters.
Introducing, from Louisville, Kentucky, he's wearing red trunks. He weighs 215, undefeated in 31 bouts, scoring 25 knockouts. Here is Muhammad Ali. His opponent from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he's wearing green trunks. He weighs 205 and a half pounds, undefeated in 26 bouts, scoring 23 knockouts, the heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Frazier. Good evening, Joe and Muhammad. Since this contest is for the final determination of the heavyweight championship of the world, we ask you to pay particular attention to the rules of the New York State Athletic Commission. In the event of a knockdown, you must take an 8 count. The other man must retire to the neutral corner. Shake hands now, man.
I don't know about you, but when I hear that Muhammad Ali... Randy, for those of you listening on the audio podcast, Randy's got his hand over his heart, because it's like we're both kind of, it's a tingling, it's a sensation knowing that those were the moments. But to hear Ali come in at 215 and Frazier come in at 205 and a half, I'm thinking to myself, what do we got, welterweights here? In light of what we've seen. But the fascinating part of that, and again, we thank William Greaves Productions for allowing us to show that short clip from The Fighters. And I heartily recommend that you look it out. It is on YouTube, and find it and watch the documentary, watch the feature. What struck me, Randy, is here's Ali, the guy who's got the brash mouth, who can't wait to shoot that mouth off at everybody he possibly can. And he is as quiet, he is as calm, maybe too calm. And here's Frazier in his locker room, shadow boxing and punching, and he knows the cameras are on him the whole time. As a matter of fact, what you didn't see before that is he orchestrated the whole thing. telling, make sure you get a shot here, make sure you do this. If the camera's going to be on, make sure it's over here. He knew he was playing to the cameras and needing that. And there it was, the showmanship from Frazier. It's a direct contrast of what we later knew these two boxers to be, which is why it makes the lead up to this fight maybe even just as fascinating than the fight itself.
Oh, no question about it. You know, and as I watch that again, and as I watch the YouTube versions and everything over again, and then I go back to when I was commissioner and I'm one-on-one with Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, and I've asked every question I could possibly think of, and I used to tell them, listen, I'm here because we're friends. I'm here because I'm the commissioner. We're having breakfast. We're having lunch. I don't have a tape recorder with me. I'm not a reporter now. I'm your friend. But I do have to ask you some of these questions about the fight. And I asked probably more to Muhammad than I did Joe. And I asked Ali, because I had seen that before, the fighters. And I said, I know how laid back in the dressing room you were. Was there any reason for that? And Ali said, oh, I wasn't going to let on, but I knew that in a few minutes I'd be in that ring and I'd be in for hell, because I knew Joe Frazier was coming at me and I wasn't going to be getting rid of him early, that I was going to have a long, hard fight in front of me. And he said that's why in the fight before that, 3 months earlier, he said, I'm glad that I went 15 rounds with Oscar Bonavena because I needed that work. I wouldn't have wanted to go into the fight, offer a 3-round fight against Jerry Quarry and a quick one against Bonavena. He said, I needed that work. And sure enough, Joe Frazier gave me everything and then some. He said, there's never been anybody tougher than Joe Frazier.
And then we get to the fight itself, and a fight that everybody has seen time and time again. And I think you're right. We all kind of sit there. It's one of those things where if you've got a couple of minutes to spend as a boxing fan, I don't know about you, but you probably do. That's the fight I go to. I'll go watch Ali Frazier over and over again. I won't watch Tyson. I won't watch Foreman. I won't watch Spinks. And I get it. Everybody will like it. But to me, those are the fights that you have to watch. And you have to kind of get an idea of what it was like at that time to watch those boxers going at it. Then the fight's over, and then we are getting ready for number 2. And you had alluded to this earlier, and again, this is something that many people have never seen before. It's out there, and again, this is something that anybody can see. It's not as if it's proprietary material, but it was on January the 26th of 1974, when Ali and Frazier got together. They brought them into the ABC Wide World of Sports studios with Howard Cosell, who was there to have both boxers and to talk about the fight. And this is where I think, well, I'm going to get your take on it, because I think this is where things really changed for Joe in so many ways after this happened, because Ali baited him and went after him, and Joe finally snapped.
That's sad. So what difference? Why'd you bring up the hospital? I went to the hospital for
Why you think I'm ignorant?
I went to the hospital for 10 minutes.
Why you think I'm ignorant?
Man, you know, sit down.
Yeah. Sit down, man.
Sit down, Joe.
Why you think I'm ignorant?
Sit down, Joe.
Huh?
Sit down quick.
Why you think I'm ignorant?
The brothers are here.
Doing this too?
No. Sit down quick, Joe.
For real between the two fighters. This kind of thing has been going on all along in terms of promotion of the fight, and this time it seems to be for real, because Joe Frazier is really angry. Muhammad called him ignorant, and he's really angry. I don't think this one is clowning at all. It's a bad and an ugly scene, and it's unfortunate, I think, that it's happened in the middle of showing a classic fight between two extraordinary athletes. I think that Ali is probably clowning, but there is no question in my mind that Joe Frazier is not clowning.
Randy, I think that left a mark on Joe, because Mark Cram Jr. has written a brilliant book about Joe Frazier and his life, and we've had Mark on the show and we've talked about Joe. And Joe always felt as if, and I think correctly so, he was the guy who was the villain. He was the bad guy. Ali was the good guy. He was in the graces of America at that point. And I think Joe, rightfully so, felt that he had been made the villain in all this. And I know that Joe years later said that he forgave Muhammad, but damn it, Randy, I don't think he ever got over it. And I don't think that if you take these fights, Joe might have won and retained his heavyweight championship on that first night in 1971 when they met. But then if you take everything in its whole, and then to that night, we're on national television that afternoon, when Joe lost it and attacked Muhammad, I think that was the end for Joe in so many ways, where he was never able to recover his reputation, his brand, his name, if you will. And maybe the only time that he did get it back was when people took sympathy on him in his later years. And that's a tragic, tragic epilogue for this whole series.
Muhammad told me, one day he said, "What do you think my biggest regret in life?" And he was talking about some of his regrets. He told me that his biggest regret was turning his back in and around 1965 on Malcolm X. But he said, my biggest regret was letting this war with Joe Frazier go on way too long. He said, because by the time, he said, and I knew that we'd be fighting a second time, so I was building it up the way I always do, and I got carried away, and I went after Joe's every weakness that he might have had, and his weakness wasn't in the ring. His weakness that he wasn't a great speaker.
Well, he went after his manhood. He went after his intelligence. He called him basically dumb and stupid in many ways.
And that hurt Joe. And that's where, if you say that to a guy in the street, you're going to get punched in the face probably. And Joe had enough. He snapped. Joe had a long fuse, but that long fuse had burned all the way down. And when Ali did this, it wasn't in a back room somewhere. It was on national television. It wasn't during a break. It was on live national television. And Joe just didn't know how to come back with anything except doing what he did. He stood up and he basically got in Ali's face. And you hear Ali say, sit down, Joe. Like S-E-T, sit down, Joe. And then when Joe saw the bodyguards coming around, as he looked, Ali quickly stood up. And I asked him, did you think you were going to get punched? He said, absolutely did. He said, I knew that I had pushed way too many buttons. And I knew when Joe Frazier was joking, and I knew when he wasn't. He wasn't joking. And I expected to get punched while I was sitting there. And I quickly got up. He said, you notice I didn't quickly punch him. He said, I put my hands around him and pulled him down. And we wrestled to the floor. But over the years, it's funny because especially after that, a lot of people said to me, man, that was like WWE style. That was all set up. I said, no, it wasn't. Not at all. And I know that because I believe each guy. Over the years, I asked each guy about that so many times. It was not set up. Joe Frazier had enough, and he snapped.
Was that the end for Joe? I mean, look, let's not overdo this, but it would seem as if that was the breaking point where America turned against him. Joe turned inward. He was a very angry man. He was a very, certainly depressed and angry for all that he had done and all that he had meant to Ali and boxing. But it would seem that the first fight was, of course, Frazier's ascendancy. That was his Everest, if you will. But from there on, if anybody truly lost the fight, well, Joe Frazier might have won the battle, but he lost the war in America.
To some people he did, because I think people understood that Joe Frazier had been pushed too far. And again, that was like in 1972. And Joe kept that battle going through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s. If you remember when Muhammad Ali lit the torch at the Olympics in Atlanta in 1996, he walked up the ramp holding the cauldron, the torch.
The torch and the Parkinsons that had already...
And he was shaking big time. And then he held it to the cauldron to light the cauldron, and you could see him shaking. I called Joe because Joe had said some things about Ali then that were as vicious as anything that has ever come out of Joe Frazier's mouth. And I said, Joe, you've got to stop this. You've got to stop it. And he didn't, but I never let up on them. And it was into the 2000s, and it was around 2008, 9, 10, in that area. I was at Madison Square Garden with them when they had begun to patch it up. I was in the back with them. They were hugging. They went out. They were at a Knick game. They sat next to each other. And I saw them hugging in the back. And the PA announcer said, ladies and gentlemen, it was here at Madison Square Garden back on March 8th, 1971, in the greatest event ever, blah, blah, blah. And he said, sitting courtside, cast your eyes behind the Knick bench, because there are the two of the greatest boxers ever, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. The crowd went crazy. Joe stood up first. Ali had trouble standing up. Joe helped him out of his seat, and they held each other's hands up in the air as the crowd roared their love for both of the guys. I am sitting there with tears coming down my face as I watched that, because, man, I know what they went through for the last, since the 60s. I knew what they went through, and here it is around 2009, 2010, and I saw it over. And I know that when they left us, they left as friends.
Is it possible that, and again, I love how we all deal in absolutes, the greatest of all times, and we're all trying to look at things which are tops, no matter what we do, best, worst, whatever. But it would seem to me that while there are tremendous sporting events around the world, in every sport, individual sports, team sports, makes no difference. People watching us will say, I can think of an event right now that was momentous in the history of a country, in the history of an individual, a sport.
Of course, there were plenty of them.
Even the world, there's a lot of them. But isn't it possible, and isn't it likely in many ways, that because it was the era following the 60s and the early 70s, and then through the 70s, and the impact it made through the 70s and the 80s, and Ali's impact, and Frazier's impact as things got on, that, well, I hate absolutes, because they make for terrible bedfellows and arguments, but that this impact of this event and what it meant to America and the world, there may never be another sporting event that will come close to the legacy impact of Ali Frazier 1.
No question about it. We've had Super Bowls, World Series that have been unbelievable since that date, and even before that. We've had athletes who have absolutely shined. I mean, in every single sport. We've had events that have taken place that are just unbelievable. That night, and I do believe in absolutes because that was absolutely, there was nothing. That was up here. Everything else was somewhere in here. Because to me, every boxing event is a big event. This one wasn't even a boxing event. This went so far past it because, as we've talked about, with the Vietnam War, with the changing of America, with the attitudes of everybody, everything that was going on, they teach about this in schools. Yes. Our kids should know about this. My grandkids are learning about this. 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. And they ask Grandpa Randy, tell me about Frazier and Ali.
And we tell them, and I think they look at us sometimes and go, really? And I'm sitting here right now and I'm trying to think of every sport. My mind is awash right now in every sport that I can possibly think of. And think of one sporting event. One event. That's the key. Not one person, but one event that changed the world so much as Ali Frazier one did. And I can't. I'm sure that somebody's going to fire back. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people say, no, you guys are crazy. There's something else. There's the win in the World Cup, the great event in tennis, a golf championship. But I'm talking one event, just one.
You know, when Henry Aaron was...
Okay, wait a minute. One. You know the only other one that comes to mind? The only one. But it's not even close. The Miracle on Ice. The Miracle on Ice was a great event, but it didn't change America. This changed America.
It was an upset. It was a big victory. We wound up screaming. This was different. This just wasn't two undefeated fighters. And that's the other thing. It wasn't just a heavyweight championship.
We didn't even touch on that.
Guys stepping into the ring against each other, each one with a legitimate claim to the heavyweight championship, one by the name of Muhammad Ali, who had captured America in his way, and Joe Frazier capturing maybe the people who were totally against Ali. They wanted to see Ali get his. For whatever reason, people watched this event, and here we are 50 years later. People who weren't even born then, they could be in their 30s. Today, they are talking about that great event.
Unbelievable.
Can you imagine if that was today? If that was today,
no,
they each got $2.5 million. They'd get 250 million apiece. It would be all over Twitter and the social media. It would be bigger.
I don't know though. I'm gonna counter you on that one. See, that's another argument. We could go off for a half hour on that one. I don't think in today's society that people would understand the impact, because there's so many other things around us now that are going on, because that was virgin territory in so many ways for what it was, because we have great people who are fighting for human rights, for civil rights right now, who are using social media for the positive reasons why, and who are out there making us more aware than ever before of things which affect America, whether you're white, black, blue, green, male, female, young, old, it makes no difference. This at a time came along when nobody, when a lot of people were not aware, because there was not that mass media that was reaching everybody. You still had to pick up a newspaper, you still had to read, you still had to hear it on radio, and maybe occasionally on television in 1971. People were, really? I guarantee you there were probably some places in America at that point that were going, 2 black men are fighting for a championship? Really? And they didn't know. Now it's everybody would know. So I don't think we'll never reach that impact. It can't be that virgin territory that it used to be, socially at least.
Well, you're right. I mean, this is something we could discuss from now till 10. We won't know. I have to think if it was still, because it was Ali against his chief adversary, his nemesis, whatever it might be, Joe Frazier. And basically on that night, Joe Frazier wasn't, to me, Ali was the greatest heavyweight of all time. But on that night, Joe Frazier was an absolutely possessed man who fought the greatest fight of his life. As I mentioned, he was only 5, 4, and 1 over the next 10 years. He wasn't the same guy.
Ruined him.
Although against Ali, about 4 years later, he brought it up one more time in Manila for the Thriller in Manila. And at that time, both guys were on the back nine, if you will.
Yes.
And yet, despite being on the back nine, Ali still disliked Joe. And as you mentioned, the gorilla. It's going to be a chill of a kill of a thriller when I beat the gorilla in Manila. And he's pounding on the gorilla. Joe still disliked Ali. Ali had his thing going with Joe. And even though they were not the same fighters as they were back in 71, they brought up efforts that were just colossal, beyond anything you can even conceive of for any athlete. They
at any time.
They should have just, each of those guys told me that they were ready to quit a lot earlier in the fight. And Ali said, but I wasn't going to quit because he wasn't quitting. Joe said, I wasn't going to quit. They could have ripped my face off. I wasn't going to stop. Eddie Futz said no. I mean, that's how much they disliked each other. But again, I am just so thrilled that they left this world with love for each other, respect for each other, and like for each other.
And true, absolute sporting legends. Before we let my legend go, happy birthday.
Thank you so much. Ali Frazier, I mean, who gets a better birthday gift than that? So every time this rolls around, happy birthday to me, and that great present that they both gave me.
29 again, brother. It's great. When you can keep doing that anniversary of the 29th birthday, it's perfect, man. Just keep rolling it. Let me remind everybody, both on our video live broadcast and those who are watching it later, and also on our audio podcast, Randy Gordon, you got a lot of ways to get a hold of him. First of all, let me make sure that if you have not already, go to Amazon and get his book, Glove Affair, which is a brilliant book, A Life in Boxing. Go ahead. I know you've always got the copy there. There it is. A Life in Professional Boxing, Glove Affair, that is available on Amazon. Make sure you pick up a copy. It's great stories. You can hear Randy Gordon and Jerry Cooney at the fights, Cooney and the Commish, on Sirius XM Monday and Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Channel 156, where they talk boxing and everything else. Also, if you want to get a hold of the Commish, you can do it on social media. On Twitter, it's at CommishRandyG. And on Facebook, it's at randy.c.gordon. Facebook messes up things with names. Just look for Randy Gordon and he's there and you'll recognize him right away because he does Randy's Ringside live on his Facebook page. So make sure you pick those up. And one other way to get a hold of him, he's insane. He puts an email out there. Damned if I would do that. Email at the Commish Randy G at, but just forget the at the first. It's the Commish Randy G at gmail.com. You can find him there and everything.
That's my personal email. I want the fight fans, the sports fans, to get a hold of me.
Insane.
And I get back to everyone.
Commish, always a pleasure, my friend. Give my love to the lady Ronnie as always. It's a pleasure. We'll talk to you again real soon, my friend. Keep rocking.
Love you, Ed. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, man. And don't forget, pick up the book, Sirius XM, all this other good stuff. Make sure you catch the Commish there. Don't forget, you can catch us here. Welcome to thearena.com. The Man in the Arena is on all the major podcast platforms. You can watch us live, watch us over and over again. Please subscribe. We look forward to seeing you again. For Randy G, for myself, for everybody here, I'm Ed Berliner. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Until next time, rock on, true believers. Knock 'em out. See ya.
You're still here?
Are you not entertained?
It's over.
All right, hey. All right, good job, guys. Let's just not come in tomorrow. Let's just take a day.
Go home.
I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Go.
That's all, folks.